The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to act with yesterday's logic. Peter Drucker. Welcome to the Guyana Dialogue. I'm your hostess, Shamiza Ali. Good evening to everyone joining us on Facebook and YouTube. Please continue to send your feedback to us. We look forward to continue to grow. Our topic tonight is refuting claims of discrimination in contract awards. The Guyana Dialogue is being sponsored by Coordinating Council of Guyanese based in the US, UK, Canada, Guyana, and the Caribbean. Funding support is by well-known philanthropist Dave Narayan from Dave West Indian Imports. Please welcome my moderator for tonight, Dr. Tara Singh.
Very much,
Our
Shamiza.
speakers, good evening, Dr. Tara. Our speakers tonight are Dr. Ganga Ramdas,
Hello.
Professor Muniram Budu, and analyst
Now,
Joel Bagwandin. Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to the Guyana Dialogue. It's a pleasure having each and every one of you here this evening.
Thank you.
Dr. Tara?
thank you very much, and good evening, panelists. Let's go into the subject right now. A couple of weeks ago, lawyer, politician, Mr. Nigel Hughes, reported via a podcast program called Economy and Justice that he and his team conducted a research on contract license awards made by the government and produced figures to show that Afro-Guyanese are underrepresented in those contracting areas. While the Hughes team did not explain their research methodology and the type of data they collected, as well as data source, their findings mistakenly reinforced support for what opposition forces have been accusing the PP government continuously, and that is evidence of discrimination in contract awards. Now, a brief layout of Hughes' allegation before I pass you on to the various panelists. Now, Hughes has laid a number of claims or allegations against her. Number one, he says that development expenditures in 2022 favor Region 3 and Region 6, which are predominantly inhabited by Indo-Guyanese, to the disadvantage of Region 4 that are populated mostly by Afro-Guyanese. The second,
Next week, Wednesday.
he was saying about the three big contracts awarded for the Schooner to Crane Road, the Mandela to Eccles Road, and the Eccles to Diamond Road. They were also given mostly to Indo-Guyanese contractors, and Afro-Guyanese were only, they got contracted the value of 17%. Now, the third one was, he claims that no oil block was awarded to Afro-Guyanese, while the Kanji block was awarded to an Indo-Guyanese and the Kaichor block to a Portuguese. The fourth, the allocation of 19.1 billion of capital expenditure for drugs and medical supplies to the Ministry of Health was expended on one Indo-Guyanese base and one Indo-Trinidadian based company. Those were the new GPC and Western Scientific. Now, the sixth allegation was, he claimed that in 2021, there were 11 gold export licenses, of which 9 were Indo-Guyanese and 2 Afro-Guyanese. In 2022, the licenses were reduced to 6, with 5 to Indo-Guyanese and 1 to Afro-Guyanese. The seventh, the shore base, are owned by Indo-Guyanese, and there is one Portuguese. And the eighth is, Hughes claim that there are 22 quarries, 2 are owned by Afro-Guyanese. He didn't say specifically who owned the rest, but we'll get into that all. And then the final, the nine, he was actually trying to make a case that the opposition should be involved in the procurement process. And but I just want to mention a very important point he made. He was making an analogy with South Africa. And I need to clear this up before we begin. Now, to get a good grasp on the perspective of development and resource allocation requires a historical context and comparative approach. One cannot just extract data from 1 year activities and make credible statements. When we know that historically Indo-Guyanese have gravitated to business and Afro-Guyanese to the public sector, it should be noted that neither of these, whether in the private or public, is the preserve of any ethnic group. The public sector, as you know, is mostly occupied by Afro-Guyanese and business with Indo-Guyanese. Now, and this is how Guyanese society evolves. So if you're going to make any explanation, we got to put them within that context, which he didn't do. Now, you turn to this is the important point to the fashionable tactic of opposition critics by shifting gear, and he launches an emotive appeal by subtly drawing an analogy of this Afro Guyanese underrepresentation of discrimination with apartheid South Africa. He now injects into his narrative a powerful dose of incipient rhetoric, aligning Guyana to the once apartheid state. The youth team has failed to establish that the disproportionate contract awards to Indo-Guyanese is discriminatory. My panel will go into these. And now I call upon, first of all, I feel an important topic like this, we need to have some insight for the ordinary person to understand how the procurement process works. We have Professor Muniram Budu, who is an expert in this area. He is taught in this. He's a civil engineer by profession, so he will walk us through this process. Professor Budu.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. Before I provide a brief description on tender and procurement of contract process in Guyana, I would like to make some general remarks that would guide my contribution to this dialogue within the context that Dr. Singh has described. Every individual is responsible for his, her livelihood and position in life. That responsibility should not be transferred to the government. One of the roles of government is to provide and be a catalyst for opportunities for an individual to improve his or her livelihood. The opportunities, which could be jobs, job training, must be free from any form of discrimination. It is up to the individual to avail himself or herself of the opportunities. Now, contracting is one such opportunity. It is a competitive business. It involves a high level of risk. The contractor has little or no control over labor, material supplies, vagaries of natural phenomena such as weather, epidemic, or pandemic. I know personally of several successful contractors in the USA who had to close their business because of the COVID-19 pandemic, despite help from the government. Right? So it's a business that has a lot of risk, and you have to be willing to take those risks. Right? Now, what I'm going to do is actually provide an overview of the contracting process in Guyana as I understand it, and want to inform you that this process is similar to that in other countries such as the USA. So if Asif, you put up chart 1 for me, please. Yeah, let's go through this chart here. In Guyana, there are two entities in the contracting process. We have a procuring entity such as a government ministry or agency, and an independent entity which is called the National Tender and Procurement Administration Board. I'm going to refer to this latter as the tender board. The procurement entity has some needs. Let's say a road construction or consultancy for the design of the road, or supply of materials such as sand or pharmaceuticals and the like. The procurement unit collaborate with the tender board to produce the tender procurement documents. Then it's all over to the tender board. You remember that's an independent unit. That unit will then identify evaluators who are knowledgeable in the project area to do the evaluation. I'll come to that in little detail later on. In Guyana, like elsewhere, there are really many types of contracts, but the two major contracts in Guyana are called open and restricted. The restricted contracts can be a contract in which the contract is pre-qualified first, then goes through the open process. Or could be sole source contract, where you identify a particular contractor with certain skills for that project. These restricted contracts, according to Guyana rule in the Procurement Act of 2003, has very strict requirements. And I would advocate that people who are interested in contracting should go through these contracting requirements, and they're very detailed at the tender board site. Now let's look at some more details regards to what goes on within the tender board. And if Asif, you can put on the second chart. Let's look at this. First of all, the procurement unit, we call that sequence one or step one. It defines certain services they want. For example, for road, it might define the technical competency of the contractor, the finances required, the equipment required, the physical facilities that must be there, personnel, resources, experience, and responsibility, and performance, like reliability and so on, of the contract. That is sometimes, like in a road, is accompanied by drawings, specification, and quality control. The top part is known as the qualification. So once there's procurement documents prepared between this procuring entity and the tender board, the tender board then put that in the public advertisement, public space, the advertising newspaper, perhaps the National Gazette. And in that publication advertisement, they will state the details, the date, time, place, and format of the tender documents. And there may be a requirement for deposit. Sometimes that deposit could be about 5% of the contract price. Now remember, the whole process now, all these processes from 2 to 5 are controlled by an independent body. Now, when the tender documents have been submitted, there's a day in which they are publicly have to be open in the presence of at least the contractors. And this simply states who's in the contractor, what are the addresses of the contractor, and a bid number. That's all. No details on the amount of the bid or anything like that. The procurement or tender board then appoints 3 persons who are experienced and have qualification in the project area. These are independent people that is very knowledgeable in that area. And then they conduct evaluation. Basically, the criteria are, is the contractor qualified according to the requirements defined by the services provided by the procuring unit? And what is the price? And then they determine who the winner is. In Guyana, this is called a low bid contract, but that's a misnomer because it's not really the lowest bid. You have to be qualified. So the contractor who has to meet the minimum requirements for the qualification and has the lowest bid wins the contract. In addition to that, that contractor must also supply documents to prove their qualification and their finances and their experiences and so on again. This is just to ensure that nothing has changed during that evaluation process. Now, you could have the lowest price, but if you don't meet the minimum qualification requirements, you are a loser. Now, if you believe that you are being discriminated, then you file a written protest. That there are certain time requirements for that, and then that goes through another board, a three-man committee. Again, these are professionals that are versed in the area of the project, and they review your protest, and then you take it from there. This might end up perhaps even in the court. Right? So there's a recourse if you believe that you are discriminated. Right? Now, what I've done here is just give you an overview. If you go to the tender board site, you will see that they have several documents which are done very well for any contractor who wants to go into contract. So that's an overview, Tara.
All right. Thank you, Professor Budu. I think you said the lowest, the key word is the lowest bid unresponsible, or lowest unresponsible bid. That's
Yeah, so
really
you must meet the minimum qualification.
Yeah,
You
okay.
don't have to be the most qualified.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Thank you. Now we move on to Joel, and he's going to talk a little about the disparity in development expenditure between these three regions. And you're going to deal with the allegations about the contracts in the three major contracts, Skonar to Crane and Eccles to Diamond and Mandela to Eccles. So please proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Tara Singh. Thank you. Good evening to my fellow seniors on the panel, and good evening to the viewers. So, before I begin to speak to the question, answer the question, I first want to say that I, as I sit here presenting to you, I am a commissioner on the Public Procurement Commission. I I can't speak on behalf of the commission because the commission is made up of 5 commissioners, which has a chair and a vice chair. So I can't speak on behalf of the commission, but I can speak to the issues which are well ventilated in the public domain, and the information are accessible in the public domain. And as Professor Boudou presented a synopsis of the procurement process, I could speak to that as a commissioner, right? Just for the viewers' understanding, though, let me talk a little bit about the Public Procurement Commission. As Professor Boudou correctly mentioned, that if contractors or bidders feel that there is discrimination or marginalization in the process, there is recourse. So the Public Procurement Commission is one such body. It is a constitutional body which was established through the amendments to the Constitution, the Guyana Constitution, in the early 2000s. And then it was first operationalized in 2017, right? So this is the second, functioning commission, fully constituted, right? And the members of the commission, the commission are made up of 5 persons. 3 are appointed on behalf, nominated rather, by the government, and 2 are nominated by the opposition, right? And their approval is subject to a 2/3 majority approval in the National Assembly. So I would have been one of those nominated on the government side, right? So the opposition has representation at the level of this body. Now, the function of this body, the Public Procurement Commission, it is an oversight body which is independent, that has oversight. Its mandate is to oversee the entire public procurement system and to ensure that uh, all of the agencies are in compliance with the Procurement Act, the procurement regulation and its amendments and so forth, and the correct procedures. It is also the body through which contractors have the, you know, a recourse to the different stages and different and a procedure. The first stage, if a contractor feels that um, he he's discriminated or something wrong in the award of the contract or prior to the award, he first protests to the procuring entity. And there is a procedure that that procuring entity has to follow, which is all of this is set out in the Procurement Act and the procurement regulations. So they have to follow that procedure. Then they come to the next level, which should be the Public Procurement Commission. Then there is another set of procedures that has to be triggered um, in terms of conducting an investigation. And even if you're not happy with the Public Procurement Commission, when it's concluded there, you have another tier of recourse um, at the level of the Court of Appeal, right? So there is a recourse, and there are different stages in whenever there is a case of or one feels that there is discrimination. Now, having said that, and that little disclaimer there in my opening statement, with respect to the award of contracts that were highlighted by Nigel Hughes, you would have seen that I would have written two letters in response. My contention is that the analysis that Nigel did was first of all flawed. And why am I saying that? Now his argument is that you have more Indo-Guyanese contractors versus Afro-Guyanese contractors. But that is not a correct way to look at it. You first have to establish how many Afro-Guyanese contractors would have tendered for these contracts. And if we look, and this information is, all of this information is public knowledge. The tender board that Professor Buru referenced in his presentation publishes the minutes, all of the bids, everything, all the tenders, and the award of contracts is also, these documents are publicly available. So this is not a state secret that people don't know. Anybody could independently go and verify and fact check what I'm presenting to you, right? So if you go and you take all of the minutes from 2020 to now, right? And to ascertain now, conduct an exercise to ascertain how many Afro contractors have been tendering for government contracts and how versus how many Indo contractors. And listen, Guyana is a small society, and so everybody knows somebody. And it is not a difficult task to know who own these companies, if it's Afro, if it's Indo, if it's Portuguese. It's not a difficult task. And using this sample, and I would have explained in the case of the GWI contracts and so on, all of the persons who tendered the companies were all owned by Indo. This was a public process, and nobody else tendered for them. So obviously it has to go to one of those. So if you have 8 companies tendering and all 8 are owned by Indo Guyanese, and you have only 2 contracts, 8 people competing for 2 contracts, then obviously only 2 of them could win. So if we use Nigel logic and his reasoning, then we can argue that 6 Indo-Guyanese didn't get no government contract. Only 2 of them get, right? By his logic and reasoning. Now, when I look at the Afro-Guyanese contractors that receive government contracts, that who were awarded government contracts, what Nigel did not tell his viewers, or what his analysis did not show, is that in the sample, and I went and I looked at that very sample who bid and so on, you had about 3 Afro-Guyanese contractors, 3 of them. Not more than you probably have more. Right now, I'm conducting an exercise from 2020 to now to get to ascertain how many Afro-Guyanese contractors we have that tendered and so forth. And so, at some point in the future, when I come at some point in the near future, when I complete that exercise, I'll publish some statistics on that and so on. But using this sample of contracts that Nigel used, there were only 3 Afro-Guyanese contractors. And guess what? These are 3 Afro contractors who were awarded contracts under the APNU government. So if you want to use the political lens, we can say this is APNU people. This is APNU contractors, right? And guess what? While some of them would have tendered for some of these contracts and were not necessarily awarded some of those, these 3 Afro contractors, I won't call their names, but it could be publicly verified, all of them have active government contracts executing as we speak, and not contracts that continued from after government. New contracts signed by this government, signed by this government ministers. So, with that information, if we are to interpret that now, let's say how many Afro-Guyanese getting Guyanese contractors getting government contracts, we can, strictly speaking, is 100%, because you can't look at the percentage based on the population of the country. You got to look at the percentage based on how many actually competed, how many tendered. And if 3 Afro-Guyanese companies are tendering for government contracts, and all 3 of them are getting government contracts, then it is absolutely correct to say that 100% Afro-Guyanese companies getting contracts under this government. But that is what Nigel didn't tell you. The way Nigel presented the information is as though you got 100 Afro-Guyanese companies and only 3 getting contracts. But that is not the case. But that is the fictitious and the false story he is trying to sell. And that is why, as a trained lawyer, they're trained to misrepresent facts and they're trained to withhold information. But he telling the full story, right? And then he went on to use the example in his presentation. These are the different sides of the argument. Well, I actually reached out to Nigel. I engaged Nigel privately. I said, Nigel, let's go and have a public discussion on this thing. Your study is flawed. Let's talk about it. Let's ventilate it in the public space so that the people could benefit from this information, because you're misrepresenting facts. He's not interested in that. And so he used the argument to say now that some of his clients, he's in the oil and gas industry. He has clients in the oil and gas industry, and he has many clients who are Afro-Guyanese, would have tendered for license and contracts and so forth, and they didn't win any. So
Joel,
yeah.
let me cut you a bit. What about the 6 billion contract awarded for water treatment plants? He said all those contracts were awarded to Indo-Guyanese.
That's the one I just now talk about, the GWI contracts. Those come under GWI. All of them, the contractors who bid for them, they were all Indo-Guyanese.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you. Thank you.
So,
if you finish here, we will come back to you. We want to address the shore-based issue as well. But you didn't address this disparity in investment expenditure in regions 3.
okay, good. Great. Oh yes.
and
So let
4.
me talk about that. So again, Nigel looked at So he looked at Region 4. The capital budget for Region 4 was 781 billion. Region 6 was 962 billion. And Region 3 was 890 million. And he's contending that Region 6 and Region 3 are predominantly Indo-Guyanese and Region 4 is predominantly Afro-Guyanese. Again, that is a flawed analysis. Region 4 is more developed than any other region. Everything is centralized in terms of health care and so on, right? The needs of each region, the development needs of each region would would differ because every region has its own unique demographic and geography and what drives that economy. So a better way to really look at this thing, a better metrics. Let's look at the size of these regions, right? So Guyana is about 214,000 square kilometers, right? Region 1, or let's look at the three regions he pointed out. Let's start with region 3. Region 3, forget about the population, is 3,755 square kilometers. When you look at the budget allocation for that region, the capital allocation for that region, you divide the capital allocation by the square kilometer, you get 208 million per square kilometer, right? Region 4 size is a very small region but with a high population density. You have 2,232 square kilometers. The allocation per square kilometer is 350 million, more than Region 3. Region 6 is 36,234 square kilometer. And based on the capital allocation, it's 27 million per square kilometer. Now let me explain this, let me break this down differently, right? Why this metric is an important metric versus the population, right? Per capita. Because if region 6 is 36,000 square kilometer and your capital allocation is to build roads, road infrastructure, bridge infrastructure, right? Farm to market roads, obviously it can be more than region 4. You follow what I'm saying? The other thing too, these are the qualitative aspect of these type of analysis that Nigel are not trained to do. And even if they know how to do it, it is not in their interest to do it, right? Another thing that I want to particularly mention here for the viewers' benefit, you have these regional administrative region through the local government authority budget allocation, but you also have certain type of projects, infrastructure, capital development that are not channeled through the regional budget, but through the central government budget at the ministry level. So, for example, Region 3, right? Region 3, you have a road infrastructure that is going to cut at the back of Parfait Harmony to go all the way to Purika, right? Which is going to open up a whole wave of land, perhaps thousands of acres of land for agriculture development and so on, right? That that allocation would not come under the regional. It will come under perhaps Ministry of Housing or Central Housing and Planning Authority or Ministry of Infrastructure. So that also you have to consider. Region 4, that regional budget does not, the road that we're building, all this big infrastructure, those also come under the infrastructure budget, which is for Region 4. So if you want to get a true picture of the capital allocation per region, you cannot only look at the regional budget allocation. You have to look at the total allocation, including through central government, through housing, through Ministry of Infrastructure to get a true picture,
Right.
right? And this is the type of analysis and
Yeah.
facts, qualitative and quantitative
Yeah.
analysis that Nigel is not presenting to the people. They're misrepresenting
Yeah.
facts and misleading people.
All right. Thank you. We'll come back to you in a moment. Dr. Ganga, you have some comments on the the claims about gold export license.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Tara. Thank you, panelists. And thank you, my esteemed viewers out there. As Dr. Tara mentioned, Attorney Nigel Hughes alleges that in 2021, 11 gold export licenses were issued, two were Afro Guyanese. In 2022, six were issued, and one was Afro Guyanese. Now, under the PNC administration, the Gold Board reported 11 licenses as well on February 29, 2020. I could read that quote, but they reported that. So between the two administrations, there were also 11 Gold Board licenses each that were issued. So I don't see the basis for discrimination by the same number of licenses that were issued. I happened to get a breakdown and I compared the entities which reflect what we just said. 11, 2 Afro, 6, 1 Afro. But that's not the basis, as Joel has pointed out, that's not the basis for establishing a case for discrimination. You have to go beyond that. Now, Attorney Nigel Hughes did not state which administration did a discriminatory selection. There were 11 each, as we stated. He uses the same data in the public domain and claims that the licenses were wealth transfer, and that is highly flawed. The licenses are business licenses. It's not a transfer of wealth. It's like any other business license requiring cash and other assets to buy gold for exporting. Now, in addition to this, uh, Attorney Nigel provides no solution to the low number of Afro Guyanese applying for gold export licenses. Some gold businesses succeed while others fail. They are then unable to renew their licenses. So those are my comments on the gold licenses. There is absolutely no basis for discrimination, and the application forms, as we were informed 2 weeks ago, they don't have race as a criteria on the application form. So it's all resources, capabilities, and what you put on the table. And more so, to be sustained in this business, you have to have cash to buy the gold. So
Yeah.
that is formidable, and not all desired business people would want to get into that business.
I think he was making the claim that there were 11 licenses issued in 2021, 9 to Indo-Guyanese, 2 to Afro-Guyanese. But in 2022, the government rescind or cancel the license to 6 in number, which meant 5 to Indo-Guyanese and 1 to Afro-Guyanese. So what we are saying, if there is discrimination, why would you cancel 4 Indian license, Indo-Guyanese and 1 Afro-Guyanese? So there's no basis for discrimination there. Okay, let me
I
just,
agree with that.
he also made a point that the oil block, the Kanchi block was given to an Indo-Guyanese and the Kaicho block to a Portuguese. None was given to an Afro-Guyanese. I checked with a top source, a former government official, and he said as far as they're aware, no application was made by an Afro-Guyanese for an oil block. Now, the Petroleum Act of 1986 clearly states, Article 13, that if you want, any person can apply for a license, provided you meet certain criteria. And those are listed in Article 13. But then, if he's so concerned that Afro-Guyanese should get a license, the government was in power from 2015 to 2020, Why didn't they start to make this happen? Why you come and lay the blame now on PPP as PPP is preventing this from happening? That's my comment. Dr. Budu, you want to make any comment on that?
Well, I want to make a comment going back to what Joel was said. I think he touched on the crux of the issue that negates everything that people have been criticizing in regards to race, and that's why Joel is a good analyst. He actually identified the key issue here, and that issue is the applicants. You cannot use the whole country demographics, right, to look at an application process. If you don't apply, you don't have a chance. It's like a lottery. If you don't play the lottery, you don't have a chance. You can't say that that person win the lottery, right? And you are against that person, and you never played the lottery, right? There's an application process. You have to apply, and you have to look at the statistical base of the applicant. And I think this is the crux of the matter, right?
I'd like to make a
And
comment
you
there.
fail to do
Okay,
that, right? Then
afterwards.
all the analysis you do, right, is ridiculous.
I
Mhm.
think Joel made a very good point also. When you're dealing with roads, you're dealing with distances. So the metrics should not be population, it should be the geographic area and the span that you're covering. That's an excellent point.
All right, let's move on because time is running out. We want to go. The other allegation he made was that the capital expenditure for the Ministry of Health was 19.1 billion, and all that money was allocated to two Indo-based companies, Western Scientific and New GPC. Well, I've done some research personally on that, and that's completely distorted. First of all, drugs, medical supplies are not bought from capital expenditure, they are bought from expense budget. The only medical item that's bought from capital was equipment. So now the figures is really there's no comparison. No, they said 19.1. The actual expense budget for drugs and medical supplies at the Ministry of Health was 17.7 billion. And all of that allocation was not to the two companies alone. They were the big companies, yes, New GPC, which got about 46% of the total allocation, but all of GPC, bids were competitive, all 99 point something percent. Only a minor, less than 1% was restrictive. And the average people who tender was about 10 to 15 for each procurement. So there was no corruption or anything in the process. Now the Western Scientific, there's a bit different. They had quite a few sole source, I think about 1.1 billion in sole source, but those are for specialized type of products which only one company can supply. Now I just need to give people a background, a quick figure so they can think about it. Now the new GCP of the 17.71 billion allocated, they got 8.2 billion worth in drugs and medical supplies. The Western Scientific is 3.4 billion. 4.1 billion was given for local government purchase of medical supplies and drugs, and 1.4 billion was for smaller contractors. These were completely overlooked by Nigel Hughes. He didn't mention with them. He said the drugs and medical were only given to two companies, which are Indian based. So that's wrong. I just want to, if anybody, if you want to, anyone, a panel want to clarify anything, I can. I have all the data, but I don't have to go through it. I just want to say how that allegation was totally incorrect. Now, let's go now to, if you don't have any questions on that, I'd like to go to Joel to give a comment on the shore base. where they say as well, there's like printing money and only Indians are involved here, etc. Joel?
All right, so thank you. Now, a shore base. You see, we got to understand. I should begin by saying this. You know, when I wrote that response, my letter, which is published in two of the dailies, I got several phone calls from people, elderly people, prominent people in business, including people who is familiar with Nigel and his whole history and his family, and not just Indo-Guyanese people, very senior Afro-Guyanese who are very familiar with him and his history and how he accumulated his wealth. And a lot of interesting revelation, which I wouldn't delve into,
Mm,
but it is important to understand the history of shore bases in this country. And before I give some examples and tell you some stories about how these shore bases started, Nigel himself should tell the people of Guyana. We all know, and this is public knowledge, that the previous government gave away a whole bunch of riverfront lands, right? Nigel should answer this question. And the question I'm about to pose, I have a whole bunch of people were given land, riverfront land. There was, in fact, the there was a presentation, there was a proposition to the APNU government to build a shore base. They were not interested. The same location where the Avritnup shore base is, that proposition was made to the APNU government and they were not interested in it. They're not even interested to putting together, this is facts and people could tell you this. They're not interested in putting together people to go and raise some capital and build this thing or to compete for it. There was a process which I'm going to talk about. And then what those people who got these lands, these riverfront land, and some of them, I think there's a legal process to get back some of them, I think, right now. But what do you think these people are trying to do? They have no interest, no capital, no interest to develop these lands. They want to flip these lands, they get these lands first of all for free through questionable circumstances under the previous government, right? And they want to flip and call a ridiculous amount of money to sell it to people who actually have the resources and the wherewithal to develop these lands into something, into a development that would contribute and provide employment to the people and so forth, right? Nigel should speak to that. That is what he should speak to. He knows about this thing. In anyways, let me don't get into that detail. Now let's talk about
mm,
the first shore base. The first shore base in this country was built by is Gisby, which is a shore base company majority owned by an Indo-Guyanese company, the principals of Moneshwars, and they have a joint venture, a minority joint venture with another foreign company, right? And so when they saw this opportunity in Guyana and they started to study and understand the oil and gas industry and the support infrastructure that they would need, that the industry would need to service it, they were already the in the port business, shipping business, right? So it's a matter. Shore base is different, but you're somewhat in this whole um, shipping business already. Understand how to manage a port, the logistics of a port, and these sort of thing. Shore base is much more complex and sophisticated, nonetheless. So they started to learn about it. And when we didn't have the infrastructure, you already have Trinidad and Tobago that has these infrastructures. So Exxon was being serviced out of Trinidad. So we were practically losing money, losing business, all this opportunity going to Trinidad. And therein lies your business case to build a shore base. So they would have approached Exxon in the early days when in the 5 years period, in the earlier period, post oil discovery, to finance this shore base. And Exxon tell them no, they won't do that. Nonetheless, they managed to overcome all the hurdles, all the challenges, because they were confident as long as they build the infrastructure, they know Exxon is going to use it, right? But just that Exxon won't agree to finance it for them. So they found some way to raise the capital, and therein comes the joint venture and so on. And they build the infrastructure, and they got a contract with the service in Liza 1. The rest is history with Gisby, the first shore base, right? Now let's talk about the second shore base building at Vreeden Hoop. Now this one, I can speak even more authoritatively because I was integrally involved in the process. In both, so there was, as you would recall, I was part of the second potential shore base, which is TriStar in Versailles, and then there is Reed and Hoop. The Vreeden Hoop shore base, I was involved at the very beginning, before TriStar. I did the first development proposal for that shore base for the principals, which is a requirement for them to get their license and their environmental permit and so on, right? So I know about that process. And then when I joined Ernest and Young, the first project I went over, this is years after, was they were going through the Exxon had advertised about 2 or 3 years ago for expression, what you call request for expression of interest for a shore-based facility. And that expression of interest then moved to a request for proposal. This is an entire about 2 or 3 years process when it started, right? So I came in when this is a couple of years after I did that proposal for the Freedom Hoop. I joined EY when in 2021. And the first project was the technical submission. We had to help with the project management and putting together the technical documents for TriStar, for the Exxon, to respond to the Exxon request for proposal. So I was very integrally involved in the entire process. It was a lot of technical, a lot of millions of dollars, both companies, both principals, the Vreeden Hoop guys, the TriStar guy, Gisby also put in a tender. So you had only three. This was a publicly advertised to people to express interest, and then that moved to RFP. Only three, Gisby, TriStar, and Vreeden Hoop, respond to it, and then the award went to Vreeden Hoop. So TriStar lost, and the others lost. You can't award to more than one, right? Because those guys have about 1,000 acres. So the shore base, that is a little bit of history of the first shore base, and I give you how this shore base came into being, right? It was a process. We know we need a shore base. Exxon started a process. They need another shore base of a certain size, right? And it cost these investors tens of millions of dollars just to participate. And remember, they're not guaranteed to win. So it means the other guys who lose, they lose millions of dollars.
Okay, so let me just ask you, how do you respond to the question that Afro-Guyanese have been excluded from the shore base where they are printing money?
Well, it's the same argument. This was a public process, and like I said, from the APNU days, they were given the opportunity. The proposition was taken to the APNU government to build the shore base, and they had no interest in it. We could ask Nigel. So today I was talking to somebody, a very senior person, and we were talking about this whole thing about inclusive governance. And I said, there is something I want to write about this thing. And when you look at the sequence of events and behavior of the opposition, they have been practicing what I call exclusive. They've been excluding themselves. It's not a matter of inclusion. You're excluding yourself from a process. So you can't exclude yourself from a process and then claim you're excluded. This thing was taken to you first, your government, APNU government. You had no interest. You give out these lands for free. So people, whether they're affiliated with APNU, they have no interest to go and develop anything. And they now want hundreds of millions of dollars to flip these lands to people who actually got the money to develop it. or people who could raise the money. I shouldn't say people who got the money, people who could put together a business case
Mm.
and to raise the financing to do a development,
All
right?
right.
So they were not
Okay.
excluded; they exclude themselves.
Okay.
This was a public process, and they could have gone and started to talk and form a consortium or whatever the case is to participate. And it was a competitive process. It's not a sense of entitlement; it's a competitive
Uh-huh.
process,
All right.
right?
Thank you. Thank you. Let's thank you for that, Joel. For that insight. Dr. Ganga, you have any comments on Hughes' claim that there are 22 quarries and only two are run or operated by Afro-Guyanese?
Uh, if the quarries are doing sand, I could make some comments up. So, like my father had leased a sand pit, and we supplied sand from the road construction projects. I know he also worked alongside with Tulsi Prasad to transport stones from the mining quarries up the river. The newer sites, I don't have much information, but that kind of work requires some experience and exposure and familiarity. So if you don't have the capital to get into it, you have to know the business. The Barakara quarries, when you buy stone to build your house or to supply for road construction, you have to know the players there. You have to know how to go and buy stone and bring it to your location. So these are simple things that should allow a higher level of participation. So my final comment on that is we need to have business incubation centers so more people become familiar with the various aspects of industry in Guyana. You can't sit and just wait for information on transfers and government generosity. You have to take the initiative to go and find out about these types of businesses in order to participate in them. So I know about the sand business. I even drove truck inside the sand pit and loaded sand on the trucks.
Mm. So, okay, so going back to Professor Budu's point, you have to take risk as well. It's a high risk industry. You could also fail. We recall the famous failure of the Mazaruni Granite, which is a former state owned company, and better known for the house perched on the hilltop, where the former president of Guyana, the first president, LFS Barnum, used to stay. That company became bankrupt. It was managed by two Afro Guyanese, and then it went into receivership. And a prominent Indo Guyanese businessman bought over that, brought it to solvency, and is one of the most prosperous running quarries now. So, what I'm getting at is that this is again, as I mentioned, in relation to gold. This is a business operation, it's not a transfer of wealth. And Yu's main underlying theme has been we are transferring wealth from using state resources and push it to the Indo Guyanese to the disadvantage of others. We have another classic case where we can argue like that. Say, for example, Ghana paid out $99 billion in wages last year. Of that amount, 59 billion was paid to Afro-Guyanese because they constitute the bulk of the, when they comprise only 29% of the country's population. So can't you argue too that there's a transfer of wealth, state resources to the Afro-Guyanese? But why should we look at development like that? That is not leading to any kind of fairness or equity. That is failing to recognize the inherent problems that cause, because we develop differently, as I said in the beginning. Indians move towards business, agriculture. Afro-Guyanese mostly concentrate on the public sector employment. So that's I let's get in Professor Boudou there to make your comments on that.
Yeah, well, what I like to do is probably give a summary because of the
Uh,
time that
well,
we have now.
well,
Right?
let me see. Okay,
Yeah,
just a little comment, the summary, if you want to give.
yeah.
I just
It-
have one more question for Jewel.
well, let me go ahead and you see from what I gather and I am aware of.
Okay, okay.
Guyana is undergoing a transition from really from an impoverished nation to potentially one of the richest nations per capita on earth. A few years ago, a 10 million US dollar expenditure on a road was a very large expenditure and was accompanied with allegation and charges of corruption. Today, the government is spending billions of US dollars on infrastructure. The mindset, without evidence, is that corruption will be billion times more. So not only must physical comfort be improved in Guyana, but minds must be changed. And if you were to examine, for example, countries that were transformed through one or more high valued natural resources, you will see that success was hinged on entrepreneurship, not civil service job. Look at Dubai, for example. Race has been exploited to divide and conquer societies, and Guyana is one of those. It has caused the deepest division and the most cruel and bloodiest acts in history. Politicians who are simply interested in power and have nothing of substance to improve people's lives find race a compelling narrative to appeal to its core, indifferent supporters. Attribution of incompetence and the failure to compete successfully to racial discrimination without evidence are the domain of losers. The demographics of Ghana, as you pointed out, Tara, in some of the things you've written, is the deterrent. It will thwart persons who perpetuate racial divisions from achieving power. There is no single race that you could talk about and say, okay, these are my supporters and vote for me, you will gain power. You have to be across the board. I've seen President Ali delivering on his One Guyana message, and we need to support him and his government to make Guyana a great place to live without any of this racial discrimination. And this is what I summarize from all of these things you see happening. We always tend to compartmentalize and try and find categories. And once you find categories,
Mm,
right, you open yourself to differentiation. And this is
right,
what is happening in Guyana. All the
okay,
things that we have talked about today are really business enterprise, require vision, right?
right,
It requires expenditure, right? It requires dedication, right? Not only you have to have a group of people who are dedicated. And I know some people, the whole family are involved in getting these done. So it's a cultural thing that is required also in business, right?
mhm,
And that needs to be generated. If you lose a contract, the best thing rather than say, oh, it's racism, you have to find out what is have I done wrong? What is it that I can improve on? And people who are perpetuating racism for everything should actually help those people to improve their life rather than always to jump to racism. It's the easiest thing,
mhm,
the lowest hanging fruit, to
right.
actually make an excuse for your incompetence.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Ganga, your closing statement.
Yes, I'm looking at this situation with the low number of Afro Guyanese participating in these activities that we outlined here. So I would suggest that we have business incubation centers, starting with the University of Guyana, where more information is shared and exchanged. You need to raise capital. You can start by buying and selling to get the experience, to get your feet wet. And then the government, on the government side, they could look at the entire process to access finance. Now, let me mention a personal experience here. Um, we participated in road building. We were not given any wealth transfer. My father owned 3 trucks and participated in the Highways to Happiness programs under the old PNC, UF. Those 2 projects were Mahika Maikoni Roads and the Linden Highways. How did he do it? He gave up his job at Diamond Estate. He sold the donkey and cart used to sell firewood in the same business as his prospect competitor, the famed Corbins. He used his savings to go into a central garage and buy a Bedford truck chassis. Then he hired 2 carpenters from Buxton, Hugo and Rodwell, to build the body of the on the chassis. And after that, he got subcontracts from a well-known attorney in Georgetown to supply white sand and orange loam for the road construction projects that were taking place in the mid 60s and the early and mid 60s around that time. And, yours truly was a porter after teaching on some of those trucks. So I participated fully as well to get my feet wet. But I didn't take that path. I stayed like Joel to
Mhm.
do other things.
So your main lesson there is what?
Well, you have to take some personal risks. My father gave up his job,
Mhm.
and you have to mobilize whatever savings you have, and then look around. I built my house in Republic Park starting with $2,000, and after that, the whole department at BOG, they were amazed, and they too wanted to do that. They started learning how to buy from Tulsi Prasad, buy lumber, buy stones. Even
Mhm.
if you didn't buy, you need to go around and check how this thing
Mhm.
is done and know what lorry park is by the border market.
In other words, you have to be creative and always keep
You,
inquiring. Okay.
information, yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Dr. Ganga. Joel, your closing
Thank you.
statement.
My closing remark, I want to come back to the subject of this entire thing, Nigel Hughes. Nigel concluded his presentation by proposing some solutions, and so I tested him as I disclosed I engaged Nigel privately. It was really a test. And so he suggested in his solution that, as and Dr. Tara Singh correctly pointed out, we need to include Afro-Guyanese in the process and the opposition in the process. Well, I already give you examples. Our constitution is so designed that the governance framework of the country constitutionally, you already have it is set up to include the opposition, to have opposition representative at the public procurement commission level, at the parliament level, on the natural resource fund, they have representation, on boards and so on, right? Then he talks about including Afro-Guyanese in the decision-making process. So I said, Nigel, um, let's start by having dialogue. Let's start by having dialogue with the objective to find amicable solutions, which could then be channeled to the decision makers. He was not interested in that. He proposed that solution that we must include Afro-Guyanese and have. He is not interested in that. And he himself, who knows nothing about poverty, Nigel, from what I was told by the seniors, grew up a privileged child. He grew up in wealth. He knows nothing about poverty. He can't relate to poverty and struggles. So he should help by, if he is serious about helping to grow more Afro Guyanese businesses in this country, he should help by telling his story, how he accumulated his wealth, how his father accumulated his wealth, to share his success story, because he is still a successful attorney and businessman through successive governments, change of governments. So he should teach people what has worked for him, like how Dr. Ramdas just shared his story, his father's story, right?
Mhm.
Now, having said that, what I want to conclude by saying is that this inclusive framework is already there, and it has been working since 1992 from the entrepreneurship side, where you have people like the late Dr. Yesu Prasad and others who founded what was called the Private Sector Commission, and you have many other business support organizations, Georgetown Chamber of Commerce, all the regional chambers. These associations, these are the institutions, the private sector, what we call business support organizations, that engage with government in consultation, in helping to shape national decision making. So since 1992, for example, when you had a national development strategy, private sector was engaged through these associations. They were at the head table, at the decision-making table, and so nothing is stopping Afro-Guyanese companies and businesses to join these associations to be at that level.
Mm,
It continued with
mm,
the national competitiveness strategy, low carbon development strategy, and every single year when you have budget preparation, private sector engage with government through these associations to present what they would like to see in the budget, to present their issues and so forth. So this thing about having Afro-Guyanese and everyone for that matter at the decision-making level, or at least to influence policy decision, right? There is a mechanism in which there is a framework in which this is already in place, is in existence for the past three
mm,
decades, and it's working. The real solution is we need more people like Nigel Hughes, who is successful, to come on board to help to teach, help to bring more Afro-Guyanese on board, to get more Afro-Guyanese to join these associations. Let's find ways, as Dr. Ramdas said, we need business incubators. Let's find real ways, tangible ways, how to help to
mm.
grow Afro-Guyanese to broaden that base who are interested, of course. Of course, if they're not interested, if people are not interested in business, they don't want to take risks, right? You can't force people to do something that they don't want to do, right? So all these are things, that this is
Yeah.
what I want to conclude by in
All
terms of
right. Thank you very much, Joel. My final comment is that, looking at reviewing his whole, I call it the Hughes Declaration, I think he was trying to say that the disproportionate award of contracts may be a function of race discrimination. Now, none of the potential triggers of discrimination have been cited by him, like the procurement process was corrupted, Indo-Guyanese suffer proportionally a higher rate of rejection of awards. Afro-Guyanese suffer a higher rate of rejection of awards compared to Indo-Guyanese. And Afro-Guyanese meet all the requirements, specifications, and submit the lowest bid and yet rejected. He hasn't proven that. And no evidence of complaints was lodged by any aggrieved Afro-Guyanese to the Public Procurement Commission or the Ethnic Relation Commission. In the case of Ministry of Health, there was no complaint lodged about people who, Afro-Guyanese, who didn't get an award of contract. So I don't know for what strength he's speaking, but I would say that we need to delve a little further into these issues. This has been a very excellent discussion, and we need to do probably part two of it. If you all agree with panelists, let me know. And before I pass you on to Shamiz, I know we have overstepped by 50 minutes, but it's important that we do that. This is such a critical issue. Do you think we should have a part two?
yeah, I don't mind. I don't mind. I'll make myself available.
Okay.
We
Professor
should
Guru?
we should get some participation from our educational institutions or folks responsible
Okay, we'll
for
talk about
planning.
that in thing. We run over the time, so I don't want to. Shamiz, our host, over to you. We can't hear you. You hear? Can you hear her?
No,
No.
She's muted. She's muted.
unmute.
Oh, sorry about that. So, first, I would like to thank our panel tonight. It was, like Dr. Tara said, an important discussion. I think it was relevant and it was needed. Moving on, I would like to thank our viewers for their feedback, their continued feedback. And I would like to encourage them to continue their feedback so that we can continue to grow, not only as a panel, but we want to know what is it they're feeling as well when we have these discussions. So please continue to send in your feedback. With that said, tonight we saw that there are many things that can be done and needs to be done. The discussion can continue, but the changes, we need to have changes in place. And unless we have the proper changes, things are not going to get better. We need to move forward with positivity, with dedication, and with hope. With that said, I'm your hostess, Shamiza Ali. This is the Guyana Dialogue. Until next time, have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
panelists.
Thank you, Shamisa.